I will start off by thanking my friends here who've invited me, Gilbert Fong especially, and the other people in the translation school. And, you know, I mean, it's very kind of them to ask me back. They've already seen what they've got to get, and I'm quite surprised. I'm always surprised to be asked back. You know, I usually think once is enough for anyone, but it's very nice to be here. And of course, the wonderful people in the office, Esther and her team, are so helpful, and that's one of the reasons why I come here, because they look after me so well. And of course, dear Mr. Sin Wai Kin, who thanks to whom this is all possible. You know, he's such a generous patron. I think he's a real old-fashioned patron in the sense of, you know, he does things because he really cares about them. He's not just, he doesn't want his name sort of, you know, in huge neon lights and so on. He's just a very, very kind and enlightened person, and I want to express my gratitude to him for making this visit possible. Now, I should start off by saying that the title of this whole series of talks is not mine. I stole it from somebody else, and in fact, not only did I steal it from somebody else, but one of my former students also stole it from somebody else, and somebody else is about to steal it from them. So it became a sort of public property. It was a man called Stephen Sung Chi, one of the great figures in Hong Kong translation, who wrote a wonderful book, a short book, and he called it Hong Lam Mong Xiao Ji. It was a very clever title, you know, and I've just stolen it from him. But also, one of my former students here, Connie Chan, I don't know if she's here today, but she also used it for the title for her MPhil thesis. So it's been used again and again and again, but it's such a good title, I don't really need to apologize. I just need to recognize that it wasn't my idea, that's all. It's going to be a bit of a strange series of talks because they're all a bit different. And I thought I'd start off today. First of all, let me just make sure, can you all hear me clearly? Yeah. I had a wonderful, organized a wonderful symposium about a month ago in New Zealand, and it was extremely relaxed and informal. We just sat around drinking wine and having a good time. And this is so formal, I'm not quite used to it yet. So, you know, forgive me if I try to recalibrate my whole being, you know, because I think that what we did a month ago was set a whole new sort of standard for these things. But I hope you'll all feel relaxed and not expect too much from me, because you won't get much from me. There'll be nothing new really in what I have to say. And all I really have to share with you is an incredible desire to let you partake of the wonders of this incredible novel, which has been the main theme of my life now for about 50 years. And thanks to that book, you know, it's the most wonderful book. As I've said on many occasions, a former student of mine once made what I think is the absolute definitive critical comment about that novel, which is that she reads it in summer to keep cool, and she reads it in winter to keep warm, right? And that for me is the supreme example of literary theory, where literature forms a kind of reverse cycle air conditioning, and the book is a life support system. It is not like any other book in the world. And that makes it very special. And that is what, in the end, that's what is at the center of what I have to say. But what I thought I would do this time is, in these four talks, which very much are a series. I mean, one will lead on to the other. I'm going to begin today by putting the whole thing in a kind of historical context, because we live in history, we are part of history, and we can't avoid that. And this novel is part of history. It is part of the world's evolution, and I think it's a very important part of that world's evolution. And I'm going to talk a bit about that today, and look at the story of how different people tried to translate it, you know, from the turn of the century, by which I mean 1800. I'm not talking about this last century, but the one before. How various people tried and failed to translate it, but they made very brave attempts, and many of them died early deaths in the process. So it's quite a sad story, really, but quite an inspiring one in a way. And I think in the course of that, I want to look at the whole relationship between two things, really, between East and West, between China and Europe, but also between literature and life, between literature and public life, also literature and personal life, because in that sense Hong Lou Meng is unique. It exerts a kind of force. It has a gravitational pull around it as a novel, which is unlike any other work in world literature, in my opinion. Even the complete works of William Shakespeare don't really operate on quite the same level. And that makes it very interesting. So really what I'm doing today is telling the story of the last 250 years through the lens of Hong Lou Meng as it travels out into the world. And it's quite a poignant story. So that's today. Now I thought I would, I can never either find these gadgets or use them. Let me see now. No, I don't think I'll never manage to get this. Technology is absolutely my last. You've got it, yours. That one there, okay. Well, then I have to be able to read what I've got on the screen because it's substantially different from the handout. So I'm going to come and sit around here. Now, what I've given you here is in fact the outline of my 4 talks. And it's quite straightforward, really, but and this corresponds pretty much with what was announced and so on, although I have to say that I never really stick to my plans very much, so that it is a kind of evolving series of talks. But I think what I want to mention now is that in the next 3 talks, I'm going to be doing something quite different from today. Today I'm looking at history and social context and so on. But from next week onwards, the last 3 talks, I'm going to be looking at primary materials. And I should explain what I mean by that. I'll just show you the slides because these are the kind of things I'm going to be looking at next week and the week after. Letters and documents. I think I'll start with this because this is actually the last will and testament of David Hawkes, who was my teacher and friend and collaborator. And you see, if you look at this little extract from his will, you'll see that he names me as his literary executor. It says, my literary executor, etc., etc., and there's my name. You see, John Minford of Font-Marty Touchant. I'm his literary executor. That means that when he passed away nearly 10 years ago now, in July 2009, I inherited all of his work, which means all his papers, all his published and unpublished work became my property. And this was a very generous, but also it was a mark of enormous respect and honor, which I've tried to live up to. And as a consequence of that, and now I'm getting to the point, some years ago when I was visiting the Chinese University of Hong Kong, I was there for 2.5 years as a visiting professor, I had the idea of donating all of these papers to the Chinese University Library. And the librarian at the time was Colin Story was an old friend of mine, and his successor, Louise Jones, has continued to look after this collection of papers, and they've done a most magnificent job of cataloguing them and looking through them and describing them. And I'm going to be using some of those papers, and also some of my own personal papers that I have kept myself, to tell the story, starting from next week, to tell the story of how David and I collaborated on this project, and how we established a method of working together. It wasn't really a method, actually, just how we created a collaborative relationship, which, in a sense, broke all the rules of translation. I mean, I'm so glad that there's nobody here who I can recognize who's a great translation theorist, because if there was, I'd have to take him outside and have a big fight, because, I mean, anyone who knows me knows that I have zero tolerance for translation theory. So I have no theory whatsoever, nor did David. He said so quite specifically, that he had no theory, not even any principles, you know. He just made it up as he went along, you know. And that's what we did. And I want to tell that story to, next Saturday and the Saturday afterwards, using letters, notebooks, manuscripts, and revisions, and so on, and extracting from those primary materials a picture of the translator at work. And you might not be aware of this series, but there's a wonderful series called The Writer at Work. It came out in the 1970s. And there's one particular book in that series by a man called John Sutherland, who's one of my favorite literary critics. And he wrote a book called Thackeray at Work, in which he looks at Thackeray's manuscripts and his revisions, and through that he recreates the way in which Thackeray wrote, for example, that wonderful novel Vanity Fair. And I learnt so much from reading that book. So what I'm going to try and do in the next couple of weeks is to do that myself, and to go over some of these materials with whoever is foolish enough to come along. And then in the final lecture I will draw some conclusions, because some of the conclusions are really quite startling, because if you've looked into this, you'll know that David Hawkes really exercised the most extraordinary degree of freedom in his translations. I mean, if you look at what he did, it's quite shocking, actually. I mean, he would probably get failed by this college, you know, if you tried to get a degree in translation, because he just broke all the rules, you know. He was a translator without rules. And that's, I'm sort of giving the game away. It's a bit of a spoiler, you know. I mean, that's basically what I'm going to say. But I'm not going to just say it like that. I'm going to give you, you know, very, very concrete examples, starting from next Saturday. And now, if I can go backwards on this thing. Why doesn't it work for me, but it works for you? That's what they always say, isn't it? Ah, there we are. You see, this is, for example, a very short extract from the notebook that he kept, which has been reproduced in facsimile. And in fact, a student of mine who's here today is writing a PhD thesis about this notebook, which is a wonderful thing to be doing. This is a letter from in the library collection. It's actually a very, very rough draft of a letter which David wrote. And in this letter he talks about the way we collaborated and how we were completely independent. He never did any of my work, I never did any of his. We were like a kind of open, we had a very open relationship in that respect. And this is one of his many letters to me, where he talks about his work. So these are the kind of, these are the sort of things that I'm going to be looking at. And then this is perhaps the most interesting of all. This is the manuscript. He wrote the whole thing in fountain pen. And the whole manuscript is actually, except for the first chapter, unfortunately, which he threw away very foolishly, the whole manuscript of chapters 1 to 80 of Hong Lou Meng is in the library in Zhongwen Daxue. And in fact, it's online. If people want to look at it, they can look at it online. And I'm going to be looking at some of these corrections that he made, you see, and seeing what we can learn from them. We can learn a great deal, actually, far more than we would learn from 50 books of translation theory, you see. I think they should be, maybe if you bring all your books of theory, we can burn them. At the end of my last lecture, we can have a great big bonfire outside and set fire to all those books on translation theory, because they're very bad for you. And I recommend you to burn them. If you can't burn them here, burn them at home. Now, I'm going to start, actually, in a rather peculiar way, with a gentleman by the name of Timothy Moe, who is a very good friend of mine and a very fine novelist. And I had dinner with him about a week ago, actually. And he's what you'd call Anglo-Chinese. His father was a Chinese lawyer who used to steal his son's pocket money. I think that's such a shocking thing to do to your son, isn't it? I mean, why give them pocket money if you're going to steal it from them? Anyway, Tim was always telling me about that. He never got over it. Anyway, he's a very good novelist, and he he wrote a very, very fine novel about the early days of Hong Kong, in fact the years before Hong Kong was established. It's called An Insular Possession. And I think I've got a picture of it here. Let's have a look. Oh, there's the cover of the book, yes. It's a very, very good historical novel. Tim wrote an essay which came out in the last few years. It's part of a memorial, a commemorative volume for Professor what's his name? Oh, he teaches at City, or used to teach at City University. Zhang Longji, is it? Yeah, anyway, Professor Zhang Longji. He went on his 70th birthday, and Tim wrote an essay in which he said this: a huge what if may be permitted a non-scholar. If the glorious Hawkes-Minford translation of our times had been available to Macartney in 1793, with the editorial assistance of Johnson and Boswell, would that beautiful account of the intimate lives and feelings of upper-class Chinese have granted this English aristocrat such insight and understanding into the lives of his Chinese equivalents that it would have made a difference to the eventual outcome of the embassy? Yes, is my own reply. So he's throwing out some completely ridiculous hypothesis. I mean, he's just made it up, because he believes that he believes our translation's good, and he feels that if only Lord Macartney had had a copy of Hong Lau Meng in our translation when he went to visit, the Emperor Qianlong in 1793, the course of history would have been different. I think he's completely wrong myself. I don't think it would have made a bit of difference. I don't think books help in that sense. I think literature is terribly important, but I don't think it's any use. I think it's completely useless, except that it makes our lives more interesting and richer and more wonderful. I don't think it changes the course of politics or trade or diplomacy, and therefore I don't agree with Tim. But I do, on the other hand, agree with what my former teacher, Professor Liu Cunren, that's a picture of him there. Do you think we could have the lights down a bit? Because it's quite hard to see what's going on the screen. Those lights are terribly bright. Is there anyone actually in control of the situation, or are we just on autopilot? Oh well. Anyway, you see, Professor Liu, he also believed in the importance of literature. And he said that literature it helps us to acquire something deeper, a more intimate and sympathetic understanding of the people whose language we're studying. Now, I think that's more the point. I don't think literature is going to change the way the world works. I mean, if it did, the world would be a much better place, because we've got wonderful literature, but unfortunately human beings are not that wonderful. Look at the people running the world today. I won't mention their names because it'll make us all feel quite ill, but some of the people in charge, of all the big countries in the world, I don't think if they went home and read Hong Lau Meng for 6 years, they'd get any better. They'd probably get worse, actually, because it'd probably put them in a bad mood, But I mean, I don't think literature really makes a difference in that sense. I think it makes a difference inside people's hearts and minds. That I do believe, and that was what Professor Liu believed as well. And of course, this is the wonderful scholar from Sichuan called Miao Yue, who writes about Chinese poetry, and he once wrote a wonderful essay about Ci poetry, and I think he's got the point, you see, which is that. He says, I'm going to read this whole thing because it's such a wonderful paragraph and it really does reflect my own views. To those who are born with a sensitive spirit and an appreciation of subtle beauty, lyric verse, by which he means Ci poetry, right, can bring delight and release. It can be a source of peace, and this aesthetic sensitivity, if coupled with a sincere self-cultivation, that's Xiuyang, can greatly enhance the quality of a man's everyday life and of his literary and scholarly pursuits. Many human activities coexist. Many paths lead to the same goal. The lyric, an expression of the human heart and mind, and of human perceptions of the world, is one path leading to an understanding of beauty and goodness. So I think he, as Professor Liu was, he's sketching out a role for literature which is fundamentally the traditional Chinese view of literature, which is that literature is part of the greater cultivation of the Tao. It is, and this is David Hawkes. You see, he believed the same as well. He was a passionate believer in literature. I mean, he wasn't a theorist, he wasn't even a critic, but he was a translator. And when he gave his inaugural lecture in Oxford in 1961, he made this statement that, you know, you have to study literature. You have to study literature. In any program of Chinese studies has to have literature at its core. Now, you know, when you think that was only 50 years ago, and you look around at universities today, virtually none of them even bother with literature anymore. They're all doing security studies, you know, and international trade and Chinese politics. But I mean, if you say to them, who's teaching Chinese literature in your university? They'll say, oh dear, I don't think we have anybody. No, let me think. No, we've got nobody teaching Chinese literature. That doesn't matter. That's not important. And that's what's happening today all over the world. So it's good to be reminded that there were once people who actually believed in literature. And I do, because I'm a dinosaur. I belong to a previous age. So I'm going to proceed now by doing something which is ridiculously ambitious, which is to try to, taking Timothy Mo's remark about what if Hong Lau Meng had been available in 1793, would the world have been different? Take that remark and look at the situation that existed in 1793, basically, between China and the world. And this is really a subject for a one-year BA program. It's not a one-lecture thing at all. But I'm going to try and do it all the same because you know, I like trying to do impossible things every morning before breakfast. That's what it says in Alice in Wonderland, you know. This is China in the 18th century. And I've got lots of pictures because, you know, pictures are much better than words. And this, of course, is the great Emperor Kangxi. I'm just going to give you three emperors, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, okay? And you're not allowed to mention the name Yongzheng because he's the one who persecuted the Cao family, right? So he's a baddie, but in fact they're all pretty bad, really. They knew how to run a police state in the 18th century, you know. It's nothing new in China. And these are the boundaries of China at the height of the Qing dynasty. They really did expand the boundaries of the Chinese, the Qianxia, the empire, way beyond what they had the right to do. Now, within that Chinese world, I'm trying to focus down in, there was a small elite under the Manchus who called themselves Qiren, you know, bannermen. And within that small elite, and why do I mention them? Because that was the elite out of which Hong Lau Meng came. Within that elite there were some very, very distinguished writers and poets. The most famous of them was Nalan Xingde. And Wang Guowei, the great critic, once wrote that the reason why Nalan Xingde was such a great poet was precisely because he was a Manchu, and because he was thereby enabled to step outside the Han Chinese kind of pit, if you like, what Boyang in his wonderful book, you know, Choulo de Zhongguoren, called the soy sauce vat of Chinese culture. And Lu Xun had very similar ideas about how stultifying Chinese culture can be. And Wang Guowei, who was a very original thinker, a very great man, he threw out this idea that the reason why Nalan Xingde was such a brilliant poet, one of the greatest of all time, was precisely because he wasn't Chinese. You know, he was therefore able to bring a whole fresh energy into the writing of poetry. And you see, I believe that to be true of Cao Xueqin, because he really wasn't Chinese. I mean, he was ethnically Han, yes, but his entire cultural world was the world of the Qiren, of the bannermen. All his friends were from the Aising Yoro clan. All his friends were Bachi. They were from the 8 banners, you know. And that was where Cao Xueqin was coming from, as they say. And this is a sort of rather fake picture of Nalan Xingde's father, Ming Zhu, who got into serious trouble with Kangxi. And this is the very often reproduced picture of Nalan Xingde. And this is a very short extract from one of his poems, which I'm not going to try reading to you the Chinese. It's very, very famous. And this is my reworking of an old translation. I do love this poem. My heart is turned to ash. I am an incomplete monk, my head unshaven. Wind and rain, partings from friends dead and alive, have worn me out. This solitary candle seems like an old friend. Love alone keeps me from an awakening. I mean, Nalam Singdar's poetry is really quite exceptional. I mean, it picks up a tradition going all the way back to Li Hoju in the southern Tang dynasty and recreates it, gives it new life, new energy. And he's one of the great Chinese poets. And yet he wasn't Chinese at all. He was a Manchu. 100% Manchu he was. That's the Chinese. Oh, I'm going backwards, sorry. And a contemporary of Cao Sui-chin's was this prince. He was really a minor prince called Yong Zhong, and he was from the Aising-Yura clan. And he was one of the first people to read Hong Lo Meng in manuscript form and to comment about it. And he wrote poems about it, very beautiful poetry actually, which he wrote. Don't forget, he wasn't Chinese, he was Manchu. And a later Manchu by the name of Zhao Lian, who was a prince as well, wrote about him that he possessed the aura of the Jin dynasty, referring to the Zhulin Qi-xian, the 7 sages of the bamboo grove. And to what Cao Sui-chin in the 2nd chapter of his novel calls the pedigree of the great lovers, the Qing Shi Qingzhong, the literary rebels and eccentric aesthetes, the Yi Shi Gaoren of Chinese history, among whom Cao Sui-chin ranked his own protagonist, Jiao Baoyu. Cao himself aspired to the 7 sages lifestyle, and hence his fancy name, Dreaming of Ranji, Meng Ran. And this is something which was quite common amongst these bannermen. They saw themselves as almost as reincarnations of the 7 sages of the Zhulin Qi-xian. Here's the ancestor of 2 brothers called Dun Cheng and Dun Min, and they were friends of Cao Sui-chin's, and these are some of their books. This is actually something that I literally translated yesterday on the basis of a draft. I'm going to move around so I can read it on my computer. Of my very wonderful research assistant, Ren Luman, discovered this letter written by Dun Cheng. Dun Cheng was an aristocratic Manchu. He was a member of the imperial clan, the Aising-Yura, and he wrote this letter to his brother. And I hadn't discovered it until my research assistant, Ren Luman, sent me an email saying, do look at this letter. It is quite remarkable. And these people, the Dun brothers, they're always mentioned simply because they give information about the life of Cao Sui-chin. Not much information, but just a little bit. Nobody's bothered to read what they've actually written, and they've written some remarkable prose and poetry. And this letter, which I think is quite remarkable, is, I will try and read it off the screen because it's larger. I'll just read it because it's such a lovely letter. It's a letter to his brother. I left the capital on the 26th. Puddles of mud filled the road, and my carriage almost overturned several times. I stayed overnight at an inn in Huang village. Lying there on my pillow, unable to sleep, I arose and lit a candle. I saw a few lines of verse inscribed on the wall. The last line read, "Day after day, my blue gown is wet with tears." It was signed the Hermit of Reed Lake. I don't know who this hermit was, nor the reasons for his tears, but perhaps his predicament was the same as mine. Anyway, moved by his words, I added some lines to his. So you can imagine him lying, in this inn and adding some poetry on the wall. Long have I known that calamity is part of life itself, and yet the sorrow of it only grows with old age. I think in silence of a lifetime's many tears, gazing by the lamplight at my blue gown. When I came to South Village, I took lodging in an old temple. My bed was placed close to a dilapidated altar, and I fell asleep in the wavering shadows of its lamp. The resident monk was old and deaf, and not a courteous word was exchanged between him and his guests. We went our ways in silence. Someone once said, like the monk who left his monastery to live in a small village temple, boiling his coarse rice in a cracked pot, is this not a sufficient way to spend one's remaining days? This is very much like my current situation. But I do not allow myself to be overpowered by grief, so that my eating and sleeping habits are not greatly affected. And yet I'm unable to put away my emotions completely, like Chancellor Wang Da, who couldn't help wailing when he returned to his office, thinking of his son Yue, who'd always escorted him behind his carriage. Our brother Sung, who recently underwent similar sufferings, has the marks of fresh tears added to his sunken eyes. As for our friend Qu Xian, that's Yong Zhong, the one I just mentioned, the lissom immortal, though removed from all of this, could he too not help but feel sorrowful? As I was staying in the temple, a distressed servant banged on the door and reported that since nightfall they'd been traveling through heavy rain. The funeral hearse had begun to drift, and with their waists deep in water, the hearse pullers were unable to advance further. They had to camp out in the open instead. My sorrows deepened upon hearing this somber news. So someone's died, and in the aftermath of that death and in the process of the funeral, it's pouring with rain, and he's overcome with this rather dark feeling. After the burial on the 29th, I returned to the temple and found it surrounded by water. The only way to reach it was by raft. It was a day with neither wind nor rain, but as I sat alone inside, the gentle rustling of the poplar trees in front of the temple stirred in me feelings of deep melancholy. I found myself thinking on our old friends, and of how within a few years they had all of them faded into the desolate mists of time. The joys of yesterday can never be regained. I won't read the whole thing because I'll just read the very last paragraph. Time goes by, the living and the dead go their separate ways. Just as the exiled king of southern Tang, that's Li Hozhu, wrote, in the midst of all this, one can only bathe oneself with tears day and night. In the past, at the Hall of Joyful Peace, we could still put our beds side by side and find comfort in each other's company. That night, in that forsaken temple, in that deserted village, as I listened to the foxes howl and the crickets chatter, as I stared at the straw prayer mat, at the lone light of the candle, at the solitary shadow of the wine goblet, the events of these few days seemed to me an eon in length. And what was I? Merely a dreamer talking in my dreams. When will this realm of illusion come to an end? More than ever, I am now aware that past misfortunes are the inevitable working of karmic retribution. And yet even the keenest edge of reason is insufficient to cut through the ties of emotional attachment. In the midst of my grief, I put forward this small insight for your contemplation, as much as I would wish to make amends for what is past. The ways of destiny are beyond any human remedy. Alas, alas. It's a very, very moving little piece, I think. And he wrote many essays like this. This is another one which I won't read to you now, but I bring him forward to you because he's an example of the world out of which the Hong Lao Meng emerged. People are always saying Hong Lao Meng is unique in Chinese fiction, there's nothing like it. It just appeared out of nowhere. That's complete rubbish. It didn't appear out of nowhere. It appeared out of a very particular cultural milieu, which was the cultural milieu of the Qiren, of the people like Dun Cheng. In fact, when I read Dun Cheng's stuff, I can almost hear Cao Sui-chin talking to him. They were very close friends. And so in some of Dun Cheng's poems, he writes about Cao Sui-chin needing a bottle of wine. You know, Cao Sui-chin was a big drinker. Which reminds me, I must have some water, excuse me. If this was Longwood, that would be a bottle of wine, wouldn't it, Leah? Anyway, you see, Cao Sui-chin came out of that world. All his friends were Manchus. I mean, this is something which is not very often recognized. He belonged in that world. And that's why and his contemporary, the great poet Yuan Mei, one of my very favorite Chinese poets, many of his friends were Manchus too, you know. And of course, he was famous for his group of what they call shunyu, his poetic female disciples, some of whom are portrayed in that picture. And And Yuan Mei himself once wrote in the Sui Yuan Shi Hua, he once wrote that the Manchus are actually more cultivated than the Chinese. Even their military men write poetry. People like Naran Xingde, you see. Now, you see, these people of whom Cai Sui-chin was simply one, and there were many of them, you know, Yung Zhong was one, and of the Dun brothers, Dun Cheng, Dun Min, and many others, they had a kind of lifestyle which, of course, very much echoes the lifestyle of the Wei Jin period, of the Zhulin Qixie and the Seven Sages of the Bamboo Grove, but also the wonderful. There are so many echoes in their lifestyle of the great gathering at Lanting at the Orchid Pavilion, and the famous lines from the preface to that collection of poems, in which Wang Tizhi writes, "In this throng of men and women of distinction, this congregation of young and old, with drinking and the chanting of verses, we may converse in wholehearted freedom and enter fully into one another's deeper feelings." You see, this is very, very high idealism. It reflects an attitude towards life which, of course, is inspired by the philosophies of Taoism, primarily Taoism, but also Buddhism. And their whole life was, in fact, a work of art. And their lifestyle was, their conviviality was an expression of their deepest belief in the beauty of life. Now, you see, if you go back to Cai Sui-chin's grandfather, Cao Yin, who was a very important person, I mean, unlike Cai Sui-chin, Cao Yin is a very well-known figure. We know everything about Cao Yin because he was the Emperor Kangxi's spy. I mean, he was a spy. Let's not beat about the bush. He was the personal informant. You know, he was reading everybody's WeChat messages. You know, that's what he did in those days, because the emperor wanted to know. You know, the emperor was the chairman of everything, like another certain person whose name I won't mention, and the emperor distrusted everybody. He didn't trust a single person, whether Manchu or Chinese, but he had these individuals, of whom not many, and Cao Yin was one of them, who wrote him personal, confidential reports on exactly what was going on, and who had most money, and what they were doing with it, and who was their lover, and so on and so forth. And this was Cai Sui-chin's grandfather. And you see, it's often mentioned, but nobody really makes the connection between being a spy and writing a novel. And of course, they're terribly closely related, because spies have to look into every detail of other people's lives. They have to recreate the secret stories of other people's lives. And often they get killed, because it's a very dangerous occupation being a spy. But novelists, you see, do exactly the same thing. They actually have to eavesdrop on their characters. Of course, the difference is that their characters don't actually exist, you know. In theory, anyway, they don't exist. But the mentality of Cai Sui-chin is the mentality of a spy's grandson, you see. I can see it on every page, you know. These are confidential reports from a secret world of fiction, you see. And so I think it's useful to remember that this is who Cai Sui-chin's grandfather was. Very, very top-level, highly confidential informant to the Kangxi Emperor. And that's, of course, connected with the way that the Cao family got into serious trouble with the next emperor. And of course, Cao Yin was, in addition to being a spy, he was also an incredibly well-read figure who was put in charge of some very major literary projects, including the compilation and printing of the Chen Tang Shi, the complete Tang poems, you know, which is a kind of absolutely essential element in anyone's library, even today. And Cao Yin was the guy in charge. Of course, he didn't actually print them himself, but he was the kind of, you know, when you read today about some series, Shima Shima Cong Shu, and it says so-and-so was the Gu Wen, and he didn't do anything actually, he just put his name to it. I think Cao Yin was a bit like that, you know. And he also was in charge of this enormous thing called the Pei Wen Yunfu, which nobody uses now because you can all use Google, you know. When I was a young student, we had to learn how to use the Pei Wen Yunfu. It's a pain. I won't say where it's a pain, but it's a pain. And you have to, because it's all based on rhymes, and you have to know the rhyme. And it takes hours to look something up in Pei-Wen Yunfen. I don't use it anymore myself. I have a copy, but it hasn't been used for years. But Cao Yin was the person in charge of this project as well. And you see, that's the kind of background out of which Cao Sui-Chen emerged. And in this connection, and I haven't written this up, but in this connection I want to talk about something that happened many, many years later during the May the 4th movement, when the great translator Lin Shu wrote an open letter to Tsai Yuen-pei protesting about the insanity of the May the 4th movement. He was dead right, of course. And he said, it's all very well talking about Baihua Wenxue, you know, and that's a great idea in principle. Of course, Lin Shu wrote everything in classical Chinese, very beautiful classical Chinese. But you see, and Hu Shi, who was one of his main enemies, was holding up Hong Lao Meng as a great example of Baihua Wenxue. But Lin Shu said, don't you realize that the only reason why Cao Sui-Chen could write such wonderful Baihua Xiaoshuo was because he'd read everything classical? His grandfather had one of the best libraries in China, and he had access to everything, you know. So if you read Hong Lao Meng, you can tell that Cao Sui-Chen had literally read every poem, every poet, every prose writer, and in classical Chinese. So he could easily have written a novel in classical Chinese. In fact, some of Hong Lao Meng is almost classical. But he grew up in a household that had all of that training, that tradition, that reading, and that's why he was able to write such beautiful Chinese. Okay, now, I'm afraid really a whistle-stop tour. So I've just touched upon what I think is the cultural milieu out of which Hong Lao Meng arose. And now I want to look at what's going on the other side of the world, because we are taking Timothy Mo's idea seriously. Supposing there had been a wonderful translation of Hong Lao Meng in 1793, would things have been different? So what was going on in the rest of the world? Well, look, there it is. It's the French Revolution, you know. I mean, the world was going through some enormous changes at that time, and Britain was very much in the thick of it, you know. And of course, who was on the throne in England? A complete lunatic called King George III. If you read about King George, the mad King George, he was always being rushed off to mental hospital because he was mentally very, very unstable. And he used to talk at enormous length. He once talked non-stop for 58 hours. Now that is quite an achievement, you know. That's King George III. This is the guy who was trying to have a conversation with the Emperor Qianlong. They were almost contemporaries. And he was the one who sent Lord Macartney all the way to Beijing. And so, you know, the guy was actually certifiably insane. They eventually had to lock him up. And he was a very interesting, like so many insane people, very intelligent and highly sensitive individual. But he was just the king, of course. Now, his counterpart across the channel, the poor man Louis XVI, had his head cut off, right? I mean, this is what's going on in Europe. Of course, I can't hope to condense the entire European situation in a few minutes, but I can just, and of course, interestingly enough for me, because I come from that part of the world, at the same time they were shipping people off to Australia to found the colony of New South Wales. In fact, this was in 1788. So all around, these years were incredibly formative years in the history of Europe. And of course, at the same time, the Americans were having their revolution and becoming independent from Britain. It was a very, very seminal, I think they call it, seminal moment in European history. Now, when I was trying to understand the whole scene in about 1790 in Britain, I did quite a lot of reading, and I came across this wonderful organization called the Dilettanti Society. Now, we use the word dilettanti in rather a negative way, saying someone's just a dilettante, they don't do things seriously, they're just superficial, and a bit of this, a bit of that, you know. Now, but in those days, the word had a very different meaning. Of course, the Italian word means people who take delight. People who really enjoy what they do, right? And in the second half of the 18th century in England, a group of about 60 very aristocratic people, a bit like Duncheng and Dunmin, you know. These were people from large aristocratic families. They got together and formed a society. They'd all been traveling around Europe. They'd done what was called the Grand Tour, which is when you go to Italy and you visit Venice, you visit Rome and some Florence, and you enjoy the culture. You go to France, you visit this, that, and the other, and then you come back to England having been greatly enriched by the Grand Tour. And everybody who could did it, you know. That's a bit later on, when all the great romantic poets like Byron and Shelley, they were always, their whole life was a kind of grand tour, really. They never stopped touring Europe, you know, and staying in all the best hotels and castles, of course. And these dilettanti people were, the minute I came across them, I realized these were the like-minded fellow souls of the Qiren. These were the people like Dunmin and Duncheng. And the more I looked at them, the more I realized I was onto something pretty special. These people, this is a famous engraving of a painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds, one of the greatest painters of the 18th century. He was a member of the Dilettante Society. And they took things very seriously, actually. They were the ones who more or less launched the whole archaeological craze of that time. They set up the British Institute in Athens, the British Institute in Rome, and they eventually created the Royal Academy. I mean, these were a small group of elite, highly pleasure-loving aristocrats. But they came together in a band of like-minded people to promote the cause of taking delight. And this guy, I mean, he looks like he's a kind of comic from some comic movie. He's called Francis Dashwood. And his name is even worse, Baron Le Despencer. And he was one of the founders of the Dilettante Society. And you can see he's holding a rather large glass of wine. I wish I was doing the same myself. And they had a good time. And here's another one. This is another of the people from the Dilettante Society. And then the more I looked into it, the more I couldn't help but see this extraordinary connection, because Lord Dundas, who is the equivalent of Foreign Secretary, was the one who originally proposed McCartney's trip to China. You know, we read in the books about the McCartney, as if the McCartney expedition, as if it just came out of nowhere, you know, the same as Hong Lemong just came out of nowhere. Nothing comes out of nowhere, you know. There's always something that it comes out of. And Dundas, who was the one that originally proposed the trip, and some years later McCartney went, he was one of the members, one of the founding members of the Dilettante Society. And they were a most amazing group of people. There was only ever 60 members. To join, you had to be there at the right moment when somebody died, you know. And the society still exists. And one of the members is the painter David Hockney, you know, because they always like to have painters and musicians and artists as members of the Dilettante Society. And their motto was Seria Ludo, which means in Latin, I play with serious things. In other words, I have fun doing serious things, you see. And Horace Walpole, who was quite a prominent literary figure at the time, said, the nominal qualification for membership of the society is having been in Italy, and the real one is being drunk. So a lot of people, you know, had a very negative view of the society because they envied them the pleasure they had. And they take serious matters in a light-hearted spirit. And I think they're a wonderful group of people, and I would set them side by side with Duncheng and Dunmin and Cao Sui-chin as like-minded people. But of course, nobody in the Dilettante Society had the crazy idea of translating Hong Lemong. It's just an unfortunate, well, of course, Hong Lemong didn't get published until 1792 or 3, so but even if it had, this is another of the founding members was Thomas Anson, Lord Lichfield. And his descendant, Patrick Lichfield, was a great society photographer in the 1960s. He was a friend of Princess Margaret's and a great friend of the fashion photographer David Bailey. And I got more and more interested in these people. And this is his little country house, you see. Rather nice. I mean, I wouldn't mind living there myself. And then when you start to look at the indoors, it's pretty amazing. This is the banqueting room, echoes of Longwood, I think. And this is the drawing room. This is where we should be holding today's seminar, you see. And another living room. This is one of the bedrooms, a four-poster bed. The music room with a grand piano. The library. Okay, so in other words, in order to take the temperature of a particular time and place, you have to start exploring these kinds of worlds. In fact, even though they're very private, they're almost secret. It was almost like a secret society. But once you start to unpick the threads, you find yourself entering a very amazing world. And you know, if I follow up on Timothy Moe's mad idea, wouldn't it have been wonderful if one of these people from the Dilettanti Society, instead of going on the grand tour to Italy, had gone on a grand tour to China and had ended up in, you know, Beijing, in Peking, and had met some of these Manchu aristocrats, and they'd invited them to join the society and come back to England, and so on and so forth. And maybe they would then have written the most wonderful translation of Hong Lemeng. But they never did, because it didn't happen, you know, because history's like that, you know. Some things happen and some things don't, you know, and there's no real reason why. It's just chance, you know, and we'll see more of that later. Now, while all this was happening, during the 18th century, there was a considerable interest in China. But it was a very funny kind of interest, because it was more or less like taking China and turning it into sort of consumer goods, you know. It's a bit like David Tang and his shop, you know, Shanghai Tang. It's a very luxurious perception of China, which has got not much to do with real Chinese people, you know. I mean, and they call this whole fashion chinoiserie, you know, which means playing at being Chinese, you know. And it's rather fun, so long as you don't take it too seriously. I mean, it doesn't really reflect. There's nothing terribly Chinese about that. It's just rather pretty, you know. I actually love chinoiserie. I mean, my work is often dismissed as pure chinoiserie, which I take as a huge compliment, because I think if something's beautiful, it has to be good, you know. I mean, you know, as Keats would have agreed. And this is a famous building in Germany, in Potsdam, in the Chinese style, you know. And this did spill over into literature, but only in a very minor way. And of course, to pick up on Timothy Moe's remark, somebody did translate a Chinese novel in the middle of the 18th century, and it was a novel called Hao Qiu Zhuan. Hao Qiu is from the Shi Jing, you know, and Hao Qiu Zhuan is a kind of love story. It's what they used to call a 才子佳人小说, you know. And Cao Shui-Jin absolutely hated those kind of novels. He attacked them in chapter 2 of Hong Lemeng, you know, as being more or less rubbish, you know. But one of them, this one particular novel, was by pure chance got translated. And the story behind that is quite fascinating. It was translated, first of all, into Portuguese by a Portuguese living in Macau, in Aumen. And we don't even know who it was, but an English person called Wilkinson got hold of this Portuguese manuscript and brought it back to England and translated it into English. And then, because he knew some people in the publishing world, it got published. And it became a bestseller. It was called The Pleasing History. And there's the title page, you see, 1761. And it was a real bestseller. It immediately got translated into French, into Italian, into Dutch, you know, and it was all over Europe. It was what everybody wanted to read. And that's the title page of the actual English translation. And that's the French version. This was a later, similar thing in 1826. But I meant to add here a picture of the great German, you know, polymath I mean, I can't stand the guy, actually. His name's Goethe. You know, you're supposed to fall down on the ground and worship Goethe. I always find him absolutely obnoxious myself, so arrogant and so opinionated. He represents the very worst of German tradition in my mind, but I'm being very opinionated myself by saying that. But you see, Goethe read this Hao Qiujuan, and he thought it was absolutely wonderful. He wrote an ecstatic review about it, saying it's the most pure, blah, 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 blah. Complete nonsense. I mean, it's a third-rate novel, you know. It makes 40 Shades of Grey look like a great work of literature, you know. Sorry. It's really badly written. It's a romantic garbage, really. And I mean, but it was available. You could pick it up at any airport bookstall, you know, in 1762. It was available on the market. And it made no difference at all, because it was ultimately a piece of chinoiserie. Nobody took it seriously. It wasn't like Hong Lou Meng, you know. I mean, Hong Lou Meng would have really created a sensation if it had come out in, well, it couldn't have come out in 1761 because it wasn't finished. But if it had come out in 1792, it could have made a real literary sensation. It wouldn't have changed the course of the French Revolution, for example, or American independence, but it might have really changed the way people thought about China. But, of course, it didn't. Instead, we had this other thing, you know, this Hao Qiujuan. And I mean, you know, it was just luck in a way that it happened to end up, it was a thing that some Portuguese guy did in Macau, and a friend of his, an English merchant who was in Macau in 1720, took it back to his house in England and turned it into English. And then the other great event of this chinoiserie period was a play from the Yuan dynasty. It was a Yuan Zhaoju called Zhao Shiguo, the orphan of the Zhao family, which is set during the Chunqiu period. And that got translated into French. And then in France there was a terrific enthusiasm for Chinese subjects. And it got translated into French by Voltaire. Later he adapted it from an original by a Jesuit priest called Prémat, and it got put on stage. It was a real, here are some of the costumes. I mean, these things have been preserved. I mean, Voltaire changed the whole play. He couldn't care less about that. He changed it to take place in the Mongol kingdom, so it was like Genghis Khan, you know. Nothing to do with the original play at all. You do what you like in chinoiserie. That's what I love about chinoiserie. And here are Voltaire and his friends having a reading of the play, and there's Voltaire himself. Voltaire, of course, a very, very great man. I have to admit I far prefer Voltaire to Goethe, but that's because I prefer the French to the Germans. And here are more costumes for the plays. It was a big success. It was like Hollywood, you know. It really was a major triumph all over Europe in different languages. And this is one of the great actresses who was in the play in 1765. And this is the guy who played Genghis Khan. Well, of course, the play had nothing to do with Genghis Khan at all, but they couldn't care less, you know. You might as well call it Star Wars, you know. And this was the design for Genghis Khan. I mean, it's just wonderful, you know. I just think chinoiserie is just the most extraordinary thing. Anyway, let's get back to real history for a moment, because chinoiserie is just a fantasy. And of course, in the years following the Macartney expedition, which was a complete failure, things exploded, as we all know, all good Chinese people. You all know about the Opium Wars, the terrible things which the British and the French did. And behind all of those developments was a thing called the East India Company. And I cannot avoid mentioning it, because the funny thing is that some of the big people in the East India Company were also members of the Dilettanti Society. This is the nature of the British aristocracy. The good thing about Britain is that it enables people to be quite eccentric, you know. It's one of the saving graces of the country that I abandoned 35 years ago, is that people are allowed to be eccentric. They're allowed to do strange things, you know, and they get away with it, especially if they're aristocrats. But they also have to make money, and they have to make money by doing business, you know. And they set up this enormous, what today would be called like multinational company, called the East India Company, which goes all the way back to Elizabeth I, and ended up running India. And it ran India so successfully, it made huge amounts of money, and then it started to cast its eyes upon China. And see, here was the East India Company headquarters in London, a very, very grand building. And this was its coat of arms, you know. And these were the routes of trade, you see, in those days. And as you can see, they go as far as China, and they go round the Cape, because, of course, there was no Suez Canal. And everything pink on that map was part of the British Empire, you know. So you've got the British Empire, you've got the East India Company. This is the reality of global politics at the time. And with this whole business of the British Empire went the transformation of the English language. And there's the most wonderful book called Hobson Jobson, which is a dictionary of Anglo-Indian. It is really one of the... There are two fascinating dictionaries in the world. One is the Dictionary of Cantonese Slang, which I cannot repeat anything from in front of anyone, you know, in polite society, because Cantonese slang, as you know, is a unique treasury of the human race. And the other is Hobson Jobson, which is it's a record of what happened to the English language in India and China. Hobson Jobson itself is a non-existent word that's sort of vaguely made up of some Indian expression, you know, hazam, and then they just called it Hobson Jobson because that's what they did in those days. And words in it were used a lot in Hong Kong. I'm sure you all know that if you go to a car park in Hong Kong, you have to pay at the shroff, right? Now, the shroff was a word that came out of British India, and you look up shroff in Hobson Jobson, it'll tell you the whole origin of the word shroff. And these were the early days of the West in China, when they were confined to a very small part of Canton of Guangzhou, and they called those buildings the factories, even though they didn't actually make anything there. It was a peculiar use of the word factory. And this is when the Macartney expedition finally reached the emperor, and he greeted them in a tent, you know, in a very grand tent, with rows and rows of officials and so on. And this was what the British cartoonist Gilray, how he portrayed it. Because, of course, famously Macartney refused to perform the koto. He only went down on one knee. That was the end of that, you know. Nothing came out of the whole thing. I don't think it was to do with whether or not he went down on one knee, but Qianlong just wasn't interested in having any kind of dialogue with Mad George III. And this was the wonderful costume that Macartney wore, apparently, when he went to the court. And when Macartney agreed to go on this expedition to China, which was a huge thing, I mean, there were hundreds of people on board several ships, he had as his right-hand man a man called Sir George Staunton, Baronet. And they were old friends, and they would have been members of the same gentlemen's club in London and so on. And Staunton was really Macartney was just the head of the thing in name. Staunton was the guy who did all the work. And he took with him his little son, who was wearing the most beautiful clothes. And little George, well, George Thomas, he was always called Thomas so as not to mix him up with his dad. He went on board ship all the way to China, and he learnt Chinese. He became very, very good at Chinese. And in fact, as many of you may know, when they actually found themselves in front of the Qianlong Emperor, the Emperor was so impressed that he called him up and said, "Come here, boy." And they had a little conversation in Chinese. I would love to know what they talked about, but you know. And Staunton was able to write really quite good Chinese by the time they got to China. So here we go, Timothy Mo, you see. If only Staunton had been able to translate Hong Lo Meng on board that ship, imagine what might have happened. But you see, George Staunton went on to become a very young George, went on to become a very important figure in the East India Company. And that's his mother, wearing a rather beautiful dress. And that's his mother a bit later on in life, with her boy. He's now a teenager, and he's brought back a Chinese servant with him, you see. And this is a similar picture of a Chinese man who went to England in about 1760. And this is George Staunton the Younger, when he's already grown up and become rather an important person, and he inherited the title of baronet from his father. And this is the house that he lived in Hampshire. And this is all that's left of one of his follies, because the house was pulled down in the 19th century. Now, George Staunton, because his Chinese was absolutely brilliant, and he wanted to translate a book. So what did he do? He translated this, the Da Qing Li, the legal statutes of the Qing Empire. Must have been, it was a very hard job. He did a superb job of it. I mean, I've read the whole thing, because when I was working on Hong Lau Meng, it was very, very useful, because, you know, in Hong Lau Meng, people are always getting into trouble with the law, and they're getting taken to court, or, you know, Xie Pan, you know, is guilty of murder, and so on. And you've only got to look it up in this book, and it's all there in English and in Chinese. And this is the first, what I would call the first real translation from Chinese. I mean, forget about Hao Qiu Zhuan, that was just Xinmazuri, you know, and Zhao Shiguo, just Xinmazuri. But this is real. I mean, it's the kind of thing where I think here you have an MA in translation and law, don't you, right? Well, you see, Staunton would have been your wonderful professor for that, because he knew all about Chinese law, and he translated this book into the most beautiful English prose. I mean, it's a model of English prose. But he didn't translate Hong Lau Meng, okay. And that's the title page of his book. And these are some of the other gentlemen who went on the expedition. John Barrow was also, he had taught young Staunton mathematics when he was a young man. And he went along, and he later on was a very important figure in writing the account. And Sir Joseph Banks, he didn't go on the expedition, but he was also very interested in it. And that's his portrait by Joshua Reynolds, who was one of the dilettantes. And as we progress in time, we do now come to a figure who's very closely linked to George Staunton, and his name is Robert Morrison. And many of you will have heard of him, because he was probably the first real English sinologist. And he compiled an extraordinary dictionary, and he also translated quite a few bits and pieces. And when I was here, some 20 years ago, one of my students, a PhD student, who wrote a thesis on Morrison, was looking through his papers in London, and by pure chance, Amy Coe, her name was, she came across a letter that Robert Morrison had written, in which he translated a chapter of Hong Lau Meng. It never got published, because the book never, he proposed a book which never got published, but he translated that whole chapter in chapter 4 of the novel, in which there's a case involving Xie Pan and a murder and so on. And he translated it not badly, not well, not particularly well, because he wasn't a literary man. He was a missionary, you see. I mean, there are people who do politics, there are people who do religion, and very seldom are people who do politics and religion also good at writing literature, you know. And in the case of Robert Morrison, he wrote good English, but he wasn't a literary person. He was a passionate missionary. And he actually had 2 very beautiful editions of Hong Lau Meng in his library. And this is a picture from one of the editions, which his Chinese library is now in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And he clearly read Hong Lau Meng, because you can tell from his dictionary there are lots of phrases from Hong Lau Meng. And he started off in Malacca at the Anglo-Chinese College. And this is just a short extract from his translation. I'm not going to read it, because I've got so much else to talk about. But it's in your handout, I think. And then, of course, in addition to that, but he only translated most of chapter 4, and it never got published. So in a sense, it doesn't really count. According to Timothy Moe, this wasn't the great translation of Hong Lau Meng that would have changed the course of history. It was just Robert Morrison taking a passing interest in Hong Lau Meng, because, you know, he was a man of enormous curiosity. He read everything. And but his goal was to convert the Chinese to Christianity. That was his ultimate goal. And his dictionary was published with the financial support of the East India Company, largely through the intervention of George Staunton, who was his personal friend. And that's a page from the dictionary. He also published a little anthology called Horai Sinica, which means Chinese hours, you see. And he had planned to put the chapter from Hong Lou Meng in a second volume of this book, but the volume never came out. And just to kind of give a bit of a feeling of the period, during the time when Morrison lived in Macau, one of his contemporaries was a very talented painter called George Chinnery, who had come from India, where he painted this painting of a British family in India. And then when he was in Macau, he did some wonderful paintings. I'm a great fan of Chinnery. And that's his grave. You can still visit his grave in the Protestant cemetery in Macau. I've been there several times. So we're talking now about 1820s, that sort of time. And gradually, as you all know from your history lessons in Hong Kong, gradually relations between China and the West deteriorated until finally they broke out into open warfare. And it was as a result of that war, the first Opium War, of course, that we're sitting where we are today in Hong Kong, which, you know, has a place that has a long history and a very strong identity of its own. I'm not going to start putting up a yellow umbrella, but I mean, I feel like it. But it is a very special place, Hong Kong. It's very close to my heart. And of course, when people say it's just China, they might as well say New Zealand's just England, because New Zealand was founded more or less the same time as Hong Kong. And it's very, very different from England. Believe me, I live there. And it's a very different place, which in the course of 160 years has created a very strong identity of its own. And I say that about both New Zealand and Hong Kong. But at the same time as Hong Kong was founded, a whole range of other cities throughout China were opened up to the west and became what are called treaty ports. And this is just a map showing some of them. And this is a cartoon showing the wicked West carving up China. Looks a bit like a French cheese, doesn't it? But I'm going backwards. Why am I going backwards? No, I shouldn't be going backwards. Here. I think I just repeated some slides. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at making PowerPoint. And this was the famous Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 that established the treaty ports. Now, what I'm getting to now is what came into being was something that's generally referred to as the China Coast in English, which means the whole community of non-Chinese people who lived in the treaty ports. And there were a lot of them. And those treaty ports spread right up to the north and right down to the south to places like Yunnan, and right up to, you know, places like Dalian, and, you know, and in all of those treaty ports there were large numbers of foreigners, and most of them were pretty boring people. They were just making money, you know. But there were also some quite interesting people, and some of those interesting people did actually have a go at translating Hong Lou Meng. Okay, they didn't succeed. They failed, but they had a go. It was a brave attempt, and I'm going to talk about those next. And some of them really translated little tiny bits. For example, Davis, who was briefly governor of Hong Kong, in fact, in its very early days, and apparently not a very nice man from what I gather. I mean, I haven't met many of his friends, but I mean, he actually, stupidly enough, did another translation of Hao Qiujuan. I mean, my God, it's already one. Why do another, you know? But he decided he'd do a better one. Actually, it's not even better. But, you know, there we are, desperately needing a translation of Hong Lou Meng. And what do we get? Another translation of Hao Qiujuan, you know? It's like another 40 shades of grey. And he did translate, however, one poem from Hong Lou Meng. It's not a bad translation. That's the poem. It's the one describing Jia Baoyu in chapter 3, you know, and Hawkes translated it rather better. But at least we can give Davis credit for one poem from Hong Lou Meng, you know. But that's all he did. Actually, he did two. Now we get to the first really interesting person. I'm a huge fan of this man, and what a beautiful picture too. Luckily, we have this wonderful picture of him. His name was Robert Thom. And he died at the very young age of 39. And he was from Glasgow. He was from Scotland. And he went out to China at a young age and joined the he learned Chinese, he became very good at Chinese, and then he became an interpreter, and he joined the newly established British consular service in China. And he worked in Ningbo. Ningbo was one of the treaty ports. And Robert Thom became famous on the China coast for being what they called a China lover, right? He was terribly pro-Chinese. He thought the Chinese were marvelous. He had a Chinese mistress and 2 children. And he lived with his Chinese mistress in Ningbo. And he was always defending Chinese in court and sticking up for them. And some of his fellow consuls thought that was pretty poor show, you know, because the British are not supposed to mix with the natives, you know. But he was a bit different. And he learned Chinese. He was very good at Chinese. And probably, my guess is that his mistress probably said to him, you know, she probably called him Bob or something. Bob, why don't you have a look at this novel? And she gave him a copy of Hong Lou Meng, you know, because probably she'd, you know, been reading it on the quiet, you know, and he got quite interested in it. Oh dear, what have I done? Turn the whole thing off. Oh Christ. Oh, there we are. And you see, he translated Aesop's fables into Chinese with the help of a Chinese friend, and this is what he wrote in the introduction. Our wealthy literary and scientific men, although liberal almost to profusion in other respects, have yet done very little towards cultivating the literature of this mighty empire. That's China, right? So he's saying nobody's translated, you know, Hong Lou Meng, basically. The din of war is already heard in the distance. Hereafter, we shall know them as a great and mighty people. It almost sounds like the thoughts of Xi Jinping. A great and mighty people, the China dream, you see, forming a third of the family of man, a people whose ancient laws and maxims may form a subject of interest for the sage, and whose lighter literature may delight and instruct the general reader, a people capable of setting a bright example to the most polished countries of Europe. So you see, he was terribly, terribly pro-China. And that was pretty rare in those days. He translated chapter 6 of Hong Lou Meng. You know, Morrison did chapter 4. Sir John Francis Davis did a couple of poems from chapter 3. And old Tom decided to have a go at chapter 6. Now you see, chapter 6 is where Liu Lalao comes to visit the Rongguo Fu. It's a very funny chapter, and he does a good job of it. He calls her, for a start, Goody Liu. Now Goody Liu is a very lovely way of calling somebody like Granny, you know. And David Hawkes calls her Granny Liu. But when he discovered this translation, he said to me, "Oh dear, I wish I'd thought of Goody. It's such a nice way of calling Liu Lalao, you know, Goody Liu." And the whole translation's rather charming, but it's very short. And he just translated it for a book on how to learn Chinese. It had no literary aspirations. It was just in a book called The Chinese Speaker. So that's in your handout. And he also translated a story from that collection, Jinggu Qiguan. So he did, that's about 25 pages, and it's rather a good translation. So really, Robert Thom is a first person who actually took the idea that China had a literature seriously, you know. And I mean, frankly, Jinggu Qiguan is a lot better than, you know, Hao Qiu Zhuan. I mean, Jinggu Qiguan's got some good stories in it, and they're well written, you know. It was a product of those wonderful late Ming people like Feng Menglong, you know. And we had to read some of those stories when I was a student. And Thom was on the money. I mean, he chose some good stuff. Unfortunately, he died very, very young, very tragically. I mean, his health completely collapsed. And he was on his way back to England when he just simply died in Shanghai. And his translations from Jinggu Qiguan were dedicated to Jardine and Matheson. And they were, of course, the great Scottish Hong, which when he first came to China, he worked for Jardines, you know, as a translator, and he dedicated this book to William Jardine and James Matheson, who had been his bosses, you see. And these are just pages from that book. Now, I'm now going to go very, very quickly through some pictures, because I discovered when I was preparing for this lecture that the University of Bristol in Britain has the most amazing archive of material relating to the China coast, by which I mean the treaty ports, right? they set up a big research centre in Bristol to study the Imperial Maritime Customs, which was established by Sir Robert Hart and Ley. And that's a major historical research centre. A wonderful job they're doing. And as part of that, they've started to collect an archive of early photographs of the China coast. It's all online. There are thousands and thousands of photographs. You can spend days looking at it. It's actually fascinating. I just picked a few. I'm going to whiz through them because time is short. See, this is a very early view of Fuzhou, when of course photography was an infant art in those days, and this is not a photograph. This is an etching of Ningbo by one of the foreign residents when it first became a treaty port. Fuzhou. This is Fuzhou Arsenal, where they were supposed to build ships. A Ningbo kindergarten. This is Xiamen. This is also the island of Gulangyu, you know, at Xiamen, where all the foreigners stayed. This was the Gulangyu International Police Force. And this is one of the very first churches on the China coast, built in Xiamen. And there's a Western lady, you see, being carried in a sedan chair. She would have been one of the early ladies on the China coast. And this you see is, these were the warehouses in Ningbo. And I always used to think that word was pronounced God-own, right? But of course it's not. It's pronounced go down, right? And it's a word that comes in Hobson Jobson. It's part of Anglo-Indian. It goes back to the Malay word gudang, and it means a warehouse, and it's pronounced go down, not God own. For years I thought it was pronounced God own. Anyway, it's a go down, and it's a very common word in the British Empire, originating in Malaya, actually, from the Malay word gudang. And of course, a very, very important component of the China coast was Hong Kong. And this is an early-ish picture of Central. And then, as part of this whole community, they trained interpreters. The British Colonial and Consular Office trained interpreters in Peking. And this is a group of them in 1888. They took it very seriously, and they produced some very good linguists. Customs Office, Ningbo. Oh, I like this picture. Mr. Watson. It's just called Mr. Watson, the policeman, and he was one of the Western policemen in Ningbo. He looked quite a character, doesn't he? Someone could make a wonderful TV series just called China Coast. You know, it'd be fascinating. I could imagine all sorts of strange things going on. And Robert Thom would be one of the main characters with his Chinese mistress and his two wives and so on. I mean, it would be fascinating. And you could have Jardine and Matheson. I mean, I think someone with connections in the Hong Kong film world should suggest it would be could be a big success. Maybe Netflix will produce it. Here's another, and this is the British consulate in Ningbo. They built very beautiful places in those days. This is one of the main streets in Tianjin. That's the only treaty port I've lived in myself for 2 years. And of course, Victoria Road is now, I think, called Jiefang. I can't remember, but it's one of the main streets in Tianjin anyway. This is what used to be called the French Park. This is the old French concession, which is where, what's the name of the big department store in Tianjin? Chenye-Chang, right? It's probably near where Chenye-Chang is, you see. The old French concession. And this is one of the big houses in the old British concession in Tianjin. And this is the house where Puyi went to live in Tianjin, in the British concession, in the 30s. And you see, some of the Westerners like to dress up as Chinese. I think that this will be part of the movie, you know, part of this 12-part Netflix series called The China Coast. Will be some strange Westerners who dress up in Chinese gowns, you know. I mean, I think they might be part of the, you know, society of dilettanti, you see, and they like to have a nice time. And here's some more dressing up in Chinese gowns, you know. And there's one looking particularly interesting. I think there were some quite eccentric people. They're probably all British, because I don't think the French would do that. The French would be doing other naughty things, but they wouldn't be doing this. And this is the commissioner's house in Canton. I mean, they lived in style because, as we all know, they were taking lots of money out of China and spending it on themselves. And this is the tea party. This is at home. another grand house. This is a fancy dress party. They knew how to enjoy themselves. Another fancy dress party. All these photographs are in the Bristol University archive. And they went off on picnics, you see. And they had pets, they had dogs. That's a young girl with her dog in Shanghai. A tea party. Children with their armors. They had little nannies, you know. And the missionaries and their wives gave tea parties. This was a Shantou. Anyway, so that's just a kind of atmospheric collection of photographs of the China coast. It was a real place, you know. I know that in history, colonialism gets a very bad reputation, and of course it did some terrible things. I'm not a colonialist. But at the same time, we can't deny the fact that there were some real human beings, you know, living in these communities. And some of them were actually okay. Some of them actually read books, you know, and played music. And they didn't just sort of, you know, make money and so on, play cricket and so on. I mean, they actually led interesting lives. Some of them did. Not all of them did, but some of them did. For example, in the early 20th century, the British consul general in Tianjin was a man called Lionel Hopkins, and he was the brother of the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, and he was a fascinating man. Lionel was a great scholar, and he was one of the first Westerners to study oracle bone inscriptions, the Jiaguwen. And so there were some interesting people living in the China coast. Now, one of those people was a man called Myers, and he was in the British consulate in Guangzhou, and he was one of the very early real sinologists. I mean, he picked up from Morrison, and he became very, very good at Chinese, and he was one of the first people to really write intelligently about Hong Lou Meng in English. And I've picked up this one little short paragraph. If it's lawful to avow a feeling approaching to enthusiasm for any Chinese production, then the Hong Lou Meng, or Dream of the Red Chamber, is beyond possibility of cavil, the work for which genuine admiration may be expressed. What in English literature the writings of Thackeray and Bulwer are in comparison with the wearisome and unskillful productions of previous generations, such as the Hong Lou Meng, when compared with the works of fiction that have emanated from other Chinese authors. So he's recognizing that this is a serious work of literature. That's a big step forward. And he talks a bit more about how it creates human character in complex variety. It's a very, very good little study, actually, of Hong Lou Meng. It's the first, it's round about 1845 or something. It's the first serious study of Hong Lou Meng in the English language. And I haven't got time to read it all. But one of the people that, that Myers trained as a young cadet consul official was a man called Edward Charles Mackintosh Bowra, excuse me. And that's a picture of Bowra. Now, immediately you'll see that he also, like Robert Thom, died very, very young. He died at the age of 33, even younger than Robert Thom. So far, they haven't had much luck, you know, these people. And he was a passionate student of the Chinese language. And he didn't marry he didn't have a Chinese mistress. He had a wife from Northern Ireland, and they had children and so on. And his grandson was in fact a very famous British man of letters called Maurice Bowra, who was the head of Wadham College, Oxford, and wrote many books about literature. So it was a kind of family that had an interesting pedigree. And when he was a young man, Bowra, who was a kind of romantic young man, a bit like Lord Byron, he went off to Italy to fight for Garibaldi, the great hero of the Italian national rebirth in the 19th century. So this young man went off in a passionately romantic way to fight for Garibaldi in Italy, like Byron went to fight for the Greeks, you know. And once he'd done that, he had to settle down and find a job, as they say. And he got this job working in China for what was called the Imperial Maritime Customs, which was set up by someone from Northern Ireland called Robert Hart. And you see, Bowra himself was from a Northern Irish family. So whereas Robert Thom was Scottish, Bowra was from Northern Ireland. In fact, my family is from Northern Ireland too. And he established himself in Ningbo and had a large family. That's them on a picnic. And that's his wife reading, you see. I mean, they were a very well-educated, cultivated family. And Bowra wrote a lot of interesting articles on the history of Guangdong, actually, which are all published in the China Coast Press. And that was his house in Ningbo, across the water there. And here's his wife at home. And this was his farewell party when he was going home on leave. When he was about 33, he went home on leave, and unfortunately he died on his way back to England. He was just very weakened by his stay in China. But this will be on your handout, but he was someone who read literature. He spent a lot of his time reading the novels of Balzac in French. You see, he wasn't just your boring old trade commissioner, and he wrote a very nice paragraph here about Balzac. These French novels take one out of this busy, struggling world of hopes and fears, desires and aspiration. It's no wonder that you commence the perusal of them with avidity and close the last page with regret. It is well to be removed, even for a breathing time, from the struggle for worldly success. Who was ever satisfied with it? Earthly happiness, who will confess it? A quiet heart, who has got it? Now, I thought it was worth pausing on this for a moment, because Bowra was really the first person to make a success of translating Hong Lau Meng. And he actually translated the first 8 chapters of the novel. And I've read them and reread them, his translations. They're very, very good. I wish I had time to go over them. I don't have time, but this is, there's that famous poem in the chapter 1 called the Ha Liao Ge, which Hawkes translates magnificently. But Bowra does a good job himself. And of course, his translations rhyme, Though the virtues of the gods all mankind may fully know, earthly longings and ambitions they unwillingly forego. And the whole thing rhymes, and it has a meter and so on. And he knew what he was doing. He was on the right lines. I mean, it wasn't in time for Lord Macartney, but if he'd lived, he would have definitely produced a wonderful translation. But as it was, he did 8 chapters and then he went and died. And that's another poem from chapter 5. And when he died, there was a wonderful tribute to him from a friend of his, which, I think I'll read the first sentence because it's quite important. I sorrowfully dedicate to the memory of one who was gifted in no common degree with a reverence, with even an enthusiasm for whatever is worthy and noble in the Empire of China, her history or her literature. Nor did he love these less, in that he keenly appreciated our own priceless position in the world of letters and arts. Now that could just as easily have been said about David Hawkes, you see. He was passionate in his love of Chinese literature, but he also read widely and passionately in Western literature. And that was true of Bowra. So really Bowra was a breakthrough. It was a breakthrough in the history of translating Hong Lau Meng, very important breakthrough. And this is his boss, a cartoon with the characters. It must be a reverse photograph. Now, while Bowra was so very positive about the Chinese literary tradition, there were certainly people who were not quite so positive. And one of them was this very weird character who would definitely be in the 12-part movie, called Karl Gutzlaff, who was an absolute rogue. And he also liked to dress up in fancy Chinese clothes and ship Bibles to China but on opium ships. And he really hated Hong Lau Meng. He just thought it was disgusting, and wrote he also thought that Zhao Baoyu was a girl. I mean, I find that very interesting, that he read the novel in Chinese and he actually thought that Zhao Baoyu was a lady. mind you, one could be forgiven for thinking that Zhao Baiyu was a lady, because he's quite effeminate. I think he's in touch with his inner woman. I think that's what they say. But he actually thought he was of the female gender, which shows he didn't read very carefully. But he thought it was a load of rubbish, and he wrote very rude things about it. And so did the Reverend Eitel. So in other words, this novel was never going to please the missionaries. It wasn't a missionary-type novel. It was far from it, actually. It's an extremely corrupting novel. In fact, there's a wonderful piece of late 19th century Chinese essay in which the guy says, it's so humiliating that the West is doing so well and China's doing so badly. In order to correct this, we need to send copies of Hong Lou Meng to the West, because it'll corrupt them so much they'll all give up. They'll become hopeless like Zhao Baiyu, and they'll never manage to conquer China. So that was an interesting mirror reflection on Timothy Mo, because by using Hong Lou Meng, you see, they reckon they could destroy the West because it's such an incredibly decadent and corrupting book. They have a point there, actually. And then we're getting close to the end. I haven't got a great deal of stamina left, actually, but we can't tell this story without mentioning the wonderful Herbert Giles, who I talked about here 2 years ago. I think he would have translated the novel, because he had a go at Liao Zhai, and he was obviously fascinated by Hong Lou Meng. He wrote a wonderful 25-page synopsis of the novel, which I think is one of the best summaries of Hong Lou Meng ever written in any language. And he clearly understood the novel very well. But you see, I think he decided not to do it because he knew that a friend of his called Bencroft Jolly, who was the consul in Macau, in Aumen, he had already started to translate it. So I think Giles did the kind of gentlemanly thing and didn't translate Hong Lou Meng. I think it's in a way quite a good thing, because he wouldn't have been the right person for Hong Lou Meng. That was simply one of Giles's friends. I couldn't resist putting in that picture. He was a French translator of Chinese poetry, wonderful man. I don't have time to read from this, but no, I really don't have time, my goodness. This is from Giles's synopsis. It's very, very good. And his translation of the famous poem when Lin Daiyu is burying the flowers, it's a very, very good translation. Again, he rhymes it, you see. Flowers fade and fly, and flying fill the sky. Their bloom departs, their perfume gone, yet who stands pitying by? I mean, old Giles, he could turn out a pretty good piece of poetry, in the style of Swinburne or Tennyson, very old-fashioned, but rather charming. And this is the very end of his synopsis. I will read this because it talks about the very last time when Bao Yu appears to his father in the snow. If you've reached the very end of a novel, you'll know what I mean. It was on his return journey, on Jia Zheng, the father, on his return journey that Bao Yu's father heard of the success and disappearance of his son. Torn by conflicting emotions, he hurried off in his haste to reach home and aid in unraveling the secret of Bao Yu's hiding place. One moonlit night, his boat lay anchored alongside the shore, which a storm of the previous day had wrapped in a mantle of snow. He was sitting writing at a table when suddenly, through the half-open door, advancing towards him over the bow of the boat, his silhouette sharply defined against the surrounding snow, he saw the figure of a shaven-headed Buddhist priest. The priest knelt down and struck his head 4 times on the ground, and then, without a word, turned back to join 2 other priests who were awaiting him. The 3 vanished as imperceptibly as they had come, before indeed the astonished father was able to realize that he had been, for the last time, face to face with Bao Yu. I mean, he's a very good writer, Herbert Giles, and frankly, I would give someone interested in Hong Kong, I'd give them this summary as an example of what the book's all about, because I think Giles understood what was going on, and we really are almost at the end. I'm not going to talk about Bencroft Jolly, although I did say I would, but it's such a bad translation. I don't want to be mean about it. He really shouldn't have done it, but he did, and there we are. He got to chapter 52, Bencroft Jolly, and then he died. So an awful lot of people are dying, before they get to finish Hong Lou Meng, and therefore I'm very proud to still be alive, or I shouldn't say proud, I was very happy, you know. And there was this wonderful German, Franz Kuhn. I think this is my last thing. Now, Franz Kuhn translated a lot of Chinese novels. He translated Jinping Mei, Shui Hu Zhuan, blah, blah, blah. And he worked out a wonderful method for doing this, which was that every year the publisher gave him a lot of money and bought him a round-the-world ticket on an ocean-going luxury liner and said, you go off and have a good time, and when you come back, I want the complete translation of whatever it was, Jinping Mei, Shui Hu. So Franz Kuhn would go around the world, stop off in ports like Singapore, have a good time, come back, hand over the thing, and they'd give him money to go around the world again. So he went round and round the world translating Chinese fiction and having a good time. So he wrote very, very good German, and his Chinese was good. He lived in Peking for about 12 years. He was in the embassy there. Now I happened to meet in my home in France, in the nearby village, there was a German lady called Gudrun Meiser, who was something of a cultural hostess, quite a formidable German lady. And I was just chatting to her once, and she said, oh, of course, my grandfather, he knew Chinese. I said, oh, who was your grandfather? Oh, Franz Kuhn, my grandfather. I said, what, you're the granddaughter of Franz Kuhn? Tell me all about him. I can't remember anything about him, except he always gave me very nice ice cream. So all I know about Franz Kuhn is that he went round the world again and again on luxury liners translating Chinese fiction, and that he gave ice cream to his granddaughter. But you see, his German translation was put into English, and for about 40 years it was really the only translation available in the English language of the complete novel. It was very heavily abridged, about 1/4 of the length, but at least it covered the whole story. And when I come to look at the correspondence between David and myself next week, we'll see a mention of Franz Kuhn. And there were other translations, but I'm not going to mention them now. That was a cartoon of Franz Kuhn done by his son. And these are the people I'm not going to mention, so I won't mention them. And that's it. Thank you very much. I think it's customary at this point to say, if anyone wants to raise questions or throw abuse at me, that this is your chance. You know, I'm still here. You know, if you don't, it doesn't matter either. I'll just have a good drink of water. But thank you all for coming. Actually, I don't suppose Connie Chan is in the audience, is she? No. Because she wrote an MPhil about this very subject, most of which I stole for my talk, you see, so. That was many years ago. Well, as there seems to be a resounding silence, let me just briefly talk about those last people. Will it go back? Yes. Okay. I seem to have got a few minutes to spare. So those people, those names, are really the only people I've left out. And of course, the bottom one, Lin Yutang, you've all heard of Lin Yutang. Recently, they discovered the manuscript of his translation of Hong Lemeng in a Japanese library. And I'm waiting to see it because no one's been able to see it so far. Because everyone knows he translated Hong Lemeng, but he didn't publish it in his lifetime. Instead, he used bits of it for a novel of his own in English called Moment in Peking. And you can almost read that novel and pick out the bits from Hong Lemeng. Wang Qizhen was a professor of Chinese at Columbia University, and he did quite a good translation back in the 1930s, but it was very short. And all it did was to focus on the love triangle between Bao Yu, Bao Chai, and Da Yu. So it misses out on the whole kaleidoscopic architecture of the novel. So if you gave that translation to someone, they'd read it and say, "What's the fuss about?" It reads just like a Cai Zi Jia Ren Xiao Shuo, actually. So that was a very unfortunate translation, but quite well done. I mean, the actual English is quite good. And then the Reverend Bonsall was a missionary. And he translated the whole novel. And a bit like Robert Morrison. I mean, he just didn't know how to translate fiction, you know. And the whole thing is still in TypeScript. In Hong Kong University Library, they put it online because the previous librarian, his son actually, Bonsol's son was the librarian at Hong Kong U. He was also known as Charles Weatherall, and he was on RTHK. And he got the library to put this typewritten translation online, so one can read it, but it's frankly not worth reading. I mean, I don't want to labour the point, but it's just not very well done. And the top one, Bancroft Jolly, was the one I mentioned. He was the consul in Macau, and then he died in Korea. He moved to Korea as a consul in Korea, and his translation is pretty useless too. So really, that's why I didn't really bother to talk about them. But as I had a couple of minutes, I thought I'd briefly say who they were.
John, can I
Yes,
ask an obvious question? Now, you have mentioned a large number of translations, and you say this is good and that is bad. Can you just tell us, what is your idea of a good translation and what is a bad translation?
Oh, goodness me. Trust you to ask that question, Margaret. I think I'm very simple-minded, actually. I think good translations are pretty obvious. You know when you've got a good translation. I'm going to say something that's so obvious that you'll just be cringing. I'll be cringing. I mean, a good translation, I don't believe in, you know, Lu Xun's ideas about translation, or D.C. Lao's ideas, which is a translation should always read like a translation. You should always know you're reading a translation. You should never be lulled into the illusion that you're reading a work of literature. You've got to have the word translation stamped on every sentence. You know, I think that's absolute poppycock. I think I mean, my personal view, I think for a translation to work, it has to be a work of literature. If you're translating literature, it has to be literature. If it's poetry, it's got to be poetry. If it's fiction, it's got to be fiction. And the reason, I mean, the only gauge really is whether or not it's successful. So I'm an extremely functional person. I think if a translation works, it's good. If it doesn't work, it isn't good. Now, take the obvious example. I mean, I'm always getting into trouble. You're always leading me into trouble. You see, take the translation by David Roy of Jin Ping Mei, right? He spent his lifetime translating that novel, and it's a disaster. I mean, with all respect, it's got footnotes all the way through it. I mean, if you don't enjoy Jin Ping Mei, how can you write a translation? You know, if you don't find that it's the most extraordinary novel, you know, and I was going to translate it back in the 1980s, having finished my thing on Hong Lam with a colleague at Chinese U called Philip Sun Shui. We were going to translate Jin Ping Mei. And when Philip went to a conference and David Roy said, oh, I'm going to translate Jin Ping Mei with John Minford. And David Roy came up to him in the interval and said, oh, please don't do that. I've been working on it for 25 years. You know, if you do that, it'll be the end of my life. You know, I'll probably commit harakiri or something. So I wrote back, despite appearances, I am a gentleman at heart. So I wrote to David and said, I wouldn't dream of trampling on your life's work. I won't touch it. I gave up the idea. But I said, you must send me a couple of chapters. We'll put it in renditions. So he did, and I just took one look at it and thought, oh my God, what have I done, you know, because he just killed it dead, you know. I mean, look at the activities of Xi Menqing. We know what he did most of the time. And if you don't find that exciting and interesting, don't translate Jin Ping Mei, you know, because it's all about sex. And if you find sex boring, it's going to be a very boring translation. It won't work, you know, because that novel is a brilliant expose of human behavior on a very deep psychological and physical level. And it should be an absolute, I mean, it should be, I mean, you know, if he'd done a good job, his children and grandchildren will be living off his royalties for the rest of their lives, you know. As it is, it's just fallen flat on its face because it's so boring. I mean, to make Jin Ping Mei boring is quite an achievement. But, you know, he succeeded admirably in doing that. And I don't want him to, I don't even know if he's still alive, actually. But, I mean, the thing is that, so there you are, that's what I say. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Now, Ezra Pound's translation of the Shi Jing is absolutely brilliant because it works. You know, the Shi Jing, they're folk songs, the majority of them. And you can pick up Ezra Pound's translation of some of them, play the guitar and sing it, you know. it works. And you know, David's, I'm not going to talk about my own translation because that would be terrible bad karma, but I mean, David's translation, it just works. You can't put it down, you know. It's a masterpiece of the English language. And he creates a world of fiction. And I'm going to be going into how he does that, but I mean, he does it to kind of ruin the rest of my three tours. He does it by being outrageously free and by saying on every page, I'm telling you a story. You know, listen to me. It's a great story. And I'm going to play games with you with words. I'm going to do all kinds of things, which is, of course, exactly what Saskia Chin did, you know. And it works. And therefore it's good. You know, it's like, you know when someone's cooked you a good goulash, you know, because it tastes good, you know. You don't have a theory of cooking goulash, do you? You just have your palate. You know when a wine's a good wine because you can tell. It works, you know. And you know when a person plays good cricket because they score lots of runs, you know, and so on and so forth. You know when a car's a good card because it performs well. And I think a translation, if it works, and usually you can tell whether it works because people buy it and they read it, you know, and they go home and say, my God, that's a good book. Where can I get another one like that, you know? And they write stupid comments to Amazon.com, you know, and stuff like that, you know. And I mean, that's my answer to your question. I can't produce anything more theoretical, I'm afraid.
I can ask it in another way.
Okay.
Tell me when a particular translation doesn't work. What makes you think that it doesn't work? What are the things that jars on you, that makes it doesn't work?
Well, you see, most people would focus on a person's knowledge of the other language. I'm not interested in that. You can find out what another language means through hard work, you know. You've got to be working very hard to be a translator. If you don't do that, you don't even get to first base, you know. But once you've got to first base, then you've got to be able to write in your own language. And that's what people forget. And I can tell more or less from the first sentence of a translation, you know, whether or not someone's actually learned how to write their own language. Because most people think, oh, because I'm a native speaker, I can write my own language. That is completely untrue, you know. And I'll be talking about that because when I started translating Hong Lan, I wrote terrible English. I was a kind of hippie, you know. I wrote terrible dialogue, and my editor at Penguins wrote back to me and said, John, you simply can't do this, you know. This is absolutely awful. And she sent me back covered in red and blue pencil, you know. She was the old-fashioned kind of editor, and she said, you've really got to learn how to write English, you know. I mean, I'm ashamed of it, but it's the truth. And I had to learn, at the age of about 25, I had to start learning how to write my own language as a novelist. Luckily I had a wonderful role model in David, because he'd send me every chapter as he did it. But I also had to start reading my own literature, because I never studied literature. I never studied English literature as a student. So I had to start reading and learning and realizing that, you know, authors, when they write dialogue, it's not real dialogue, it's fiction, you know. And if they just wrote down what they heard people say, it wouldn't work. Again, it wouldn't work. So in order to keep your reader under a spell, which is what fiction's all about, you have to learn certain tricks, and you can tell. I mean, I'm not answering your question very well, because all I can say is I can tell straight away. You know, I don't have any doubt. It's like taking a pulse. You just know, oh my goodness, that person's got, you know, an illness, or you can just tell from about the first sentence, you know. And some people, for example, Arthur Waley couldn't write a bad sentence to save his life, you know. It was just in his Siuyang, in his education, you know. And he learnt, and the same was true. I mean, this is the theme of my last series of lectures here, all about Siuyang, you know, about how the fact that, what did they all have in common, Legge, Giles, Waley and Hawkes? They all studied Latin and Greek, you know. They learnt the fundamental basic nutrients of the English language, you know. And as a result, you know, when Arthur Waley was asked, how could you teach yourself Chinese in a few years? He said, oh, it's easy. Once you know Latin and Greek, the rest is easy, you see. I mean, most people wouldn't understand that, but I totally understand what he means. And therefore, you can't find a bad sentence in Arthur Waley. He wouldn't know how to do it because it's in his blood, you know. And you know that. And he also was a hard worker and a very great scholar, so he had all the ingredients for a great translator. Hawkes was the same. And some people, you know, I mean, I don't want to be unkind, but there's an awful lot of bad translation around, you know, terrible stuff. And people, you know, people think they can do it and they can't, and nobody's kind and honest enough to tell them they can't do it, you know. I mean, one has to be prepared to accept that kind of criticism, otherwise there's no hope, you know. And I had a really strong dose of it when I was in my 20s, you know. I was really made to go back to the very, very first basic, you know, craft of writing. That's what I spent all my time doing. I still do, you know, because that's the nitty-gritty of it. And that's what I mean, that's why I say to all my students, of whom I've had many over the years, don't read translation theory, it'll ruin you for life, you know. Because it actually forms a kind of impediment to your own ability to write. Because you're thinking too much, am I being, you know, is this skopos or is this whatever, you know. And I mean, frankly, don't do it, you know. I mean, don't just read good literature, you know, read. And that's why the standards are getting so low, because people don't read enough, you know. People, you know, in the old days, people used to think that by photocopying something you'd read it, right? Which is not true, as we know. Nowadays, they think that just by clicking on something you've read it, right? You visited that website, therefore you've read it, you know. And that's terribly bad for people's ability to express themselves and people's ability to think and write clearly. And I'm appallingly old-fashioned, you know, when it comes to that. If I teach people, I have to tell them, if you want to come to my class, you're going to have to be prepared to, A, put your computer away, B, get out a pen and a piece of paper, C, read a book, you know, and take it home with you and read it at night and just read it, you know, because there's no shortcut. That's the only way you can do it. And I'm more and more convinced of that the older I get, and therefore less and less popular as a teacher, because they want instant solutions. They want techniques and theories. I don't think they help, you see. I think it's an old art. I mean, they always say translation is the world's second oldest profession. You know, we all know what that means. But I mean, it is a very old craft, and it's learnt as crafts are learnt, from masters and from experience. Yeah. And I think one of the things that comes out of this story of people who tried and failed and died, you know, over 200 years, you know, is that there's a great element of luck in it, you know, in terms of what work floats across into another world and catches the eyes of some. I mean, you know, the book appeared in the very last days of 1791, the very first days of 1792. It's an open debate. A copy of it could have got to London, you know, in the last months of 1792, if some merchant had slipped it into his, you know, carry-on bag and taken it to London, you know, coming from, you know, Canton or whatever. And it could just have fallen into the hands of, you know, some eccentric person who then might have, but the point is it didn't, you know, it just didn't happen. It had to wait and wait and wait and wait. And in the meantime, all these slightly missed chances, all these little bursts of enthusiasm that died, you know. And it's a fascinating story, because in the telling of that story, that's what I've tried to do, but not very successfully. You touch upon these different worlds, you know, the people like that Society of Dilettanti, I mean, these wonderful people, and then these bannermen, these Manchu bannermen, and then the China coast, you know, again, an extraordinary world. And that's why I found it so interesting, because it takes you into these other worlds of other people and their lives, you know, and of course, and that's part of literature in itself, you know. I think probably time to finish. Gilbert, do you want to wrap up? Or you've got a question, have you? Yeah.
It's going to be a very easy question to answer. Anyway, so, no, I was intrigued by the quotation that you had there, just one by Eitel, was that right? E-I-T-L, Eitel. Yeah, he said that Holamong actually is the Zolaism in its ugliest development.
Oh, yes.
And that's very eye-catching. I mean, nobody in a way might now would compare Zola with
I think
Monk.
I know. I think all he meant. Eitel was not a very nice man. He was a sort of a big wheel in Hong Kong. He was chief inspector of schools and stuff.
I see.
And a pretty nasty guy, I think, German. I mean, but he was a Lutheran. Sorry, I'm not. He was a Lutheran pastor.
I see.
And he objected to Hong Lam on basically moral grounds.
Moral grounds, right?
So all he
Talking
meant
about the base instinct or the basic instinct actually of humankind.
That's right. I think that's why he was comparing it to Zola, because Zola described some of the
Yes.
the nastier aspects of human behavior and society as part of the school of naturalism and so on. I don't think he was actually comparing the novel to a Zola novel. I think he was just saying it's disgusting because it shows human beings in a disgusting light.
Yeah.
I mean, it does. It's a very peculiar novel in that sense because it does bring out the best and the worst in people. I've known people in my own life who really don't like Hong Lam. It's hard to believe because it's such a kind and gentle and easy book to get along with. But there are people who really don't like it. And for example, Yang Xianyi didn't like it. He translated it, but he really didn't like it because he was a socialist despite everything. And he felt that Zhao Baoyu was just a lazy, decadent, wishy-washy, effeminate, blah. I mean, he said so as much to me, And his wife Gladys.
And it shows in his translation.
Exactly. He has no sympathy for the book at all. And when I went back to Oxford in 1966, having spent 6 months in Hong Kong, the only person at the department was someone called Glenn Durbridge, who died recently. And he refused to teach me the book. He said he wouldn't teach it to me because it's bad for you. And he was married to a Christian kind of missionary wife. And I think his objections, they were kind of gut level. This book challenges the Christian ethic. It does. Of course it does. It's a Taoist book. It's a book about other ways of living, And some people find that very, very hard to swallow, Other people find it inspiring, I mean, I find myself very much in tune with Cao Sui-chin's way of looking at the world, Just as I find myself in tune with Zhuangzi or even Pu Songling, Other people find it very hard, It's very challenging. It's a very challenging book. It challenges so many basic Western preconceptions about life. And although in the story Baoyu sort of theoretically goes off to become a monk, he's not exactly a religious person. He's not the kind of person. I don't think he'd last very long in a monastery. It's very much in his head. The idea, a bit like Nalan Singda. I mean, he's half a monk. Half a monk. But half a monk and half a monkey, half of like Sun Wukong type, He's too his mind is too fertile, and he would never be a good Buddhist monk. No, I don't think so. He'd be one of those Taoist monks who's always drinking and, wears his hair long and so on and so forth. That's a different story altogether, Sorry.
Can I mention something? You remember the little bit when he was pondering on something or other, and in an absent-minded sort of way, he washed the handkerchiefs of his maids and hanged them out on the banister to dry. It is this sort of thing, you would imagine a delicately nurtured young gentleman doing for his maids. And I think that was very, very telling of the kind of person that was being shown.
Well, quite. He liked to play with makeup, I mean, I love playing with makeup myself, actually. I like, I won't go so far as to say I like to dress up in women's clothes, but I mean, I have been known to do that, on special occasions, fancy dress parties and so on. And I mean, these things are quite challenging for people sometimes. They like to have things, men should be men, women should be women, and don't let's get them muddled up, Whereas, of course, Zhao Baoyu was not like that at all, as we know. And it's a very challenging book, yeah. And, yes, of course, he is a very annoying young man. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, I won't go into all the reasons why he's annoying, but, my dear wife once said, why she found him so intensely annoying. Why can't he even put his own clothes on, for goodness sake, you know? She found it so annoying he had to have 7 maids to help him get dressed and 7 maids to help him get undressed and so on, and brush his teeth, you know. I mean, grow up, you know. That's one attitude. It's not the one I share, but I mean, I can understand it. You know, I can certainly understand it. And of course, the wonderful thing about that novel is that you can talk about it to people, and at the same time you're actually talking about yourself. You know, you can test people out very easily by saying, "Who's your favorite character in Hong Kong?" It's an absolute standard opening gambit, right, with all Chinese people. And after a few minutes, they all end up saying, "Oh, who's your favorite character?" You know. And then I then say, wait a minute, you tell me who yours is first, right? Because I know that trick too well, you know. And then then if you say, oh, my favorite character is Jiao Wei, oh, 你是宝哥哥, you know. And then they start off on a whole kind of, you know, number there. And I've had that game going for too long. So I always go straight back and say, who's yours, you see? And then they're usually very shy and say, I'm not sure, you know. I can't choose, you know, or something like that, you know. And but I you know, it is a kind of it is almost like a game, you know, because you can say so much about who you are by saying who you like in that novel, because they are the portrayals of personality are so precise and so live, so living, that by, you know, if you say you prefer Qingwen to Xiren, you know, you've already given away half your life, you know, you've already said everything that you need to say, you know, and it's one of the reasons why it's so fascinating. I mean, so intriguing for people in the sort of juncture between the West and the East, between China and the West, is that it's a kind of key. It's literally a key, you know, and you can make it a very interesting part of any course, you know, about China, because it opens doors all the time. Fascinating, yeah. Mm. Do I wrap myself up, or do you wrap me up, Gilbert? I don't know. Do I do a self-wrap? Sorry?
Related question.
Oh, you got a question? Oh my God.
Yeah. Just to fill up the void here. So, it's you know, very wonderful for you to guide us, you know, through the reception of Hong Kong, you know, from the 19th century on. But what do you think of the contemporary reception of Hong Kong in the West? Can you tell us something about that, perhaps?
Well, I have to say I'm very disappointed because, you know, this translation's been out now for 30 years, and it's a very readable translation. And frankly, the publisher doesn't seem to understand that this is a very important book, and it hasn't made any effort to reach out to the reading public. So it's what David and I used to call legless locomotion. You know, it sells very, very slowly. People don't read it, even though it's on another level. I mean, critics, people, I mean, they rave about it. You know, I mean, for example, the novelist Vikram Seth, you know, who wrote A Suitable Boy. He can't stop raving about the story of the stone, because he said that's what made him write A Suitable Boy. Timothy Moe, who I mentioned, is also, I mean, and so in a certain circle it's very well known, but to the broad reading public, frankly, it hasn't got there. I mean, I don't want to sound crass, but that is a question of marketing, you know. And I think, unfortunately, Penguin Books, who I've worked with for 50 years now, they don't seem to understand, you know, that this is the Chinese book, you know. This is the Chinese book. If they were smart, they would really know how to market it, you know. It is a matter of marketing, and I've tried in vain to persuade them, but they're just they're stuck with the idea that what they need to do is buy another big blockbuster novel from China, you know, and translate it, and they're always a failure, you know. They've had one after another. And they go out, they go pay huge amounts of money for them. They go to auctions in China to buy some new novel that's going to be a huge sensation, and they never succeed. And yet they've got this thing sitting there on their list, sleeping, you know. And I think it's to do with that. It's to do with the publisher. It needs to be marketed. Of course, there have been many demands for an abridged version, right? I've been asked to write an abridged version. Now, David Hawkes was once asked by Penguins, would he do an abridged version? And he wrote back by email a few words. They were, "Over my dead body." Right. Well, of course, now that he's dead, I can't possibly do it, because I would be breaking my faith with him. I've refused many times, because you can't abridge that novel, you know. It's very long, yes, it's twice as long as War and Peace, and that puts a lot of people off, but it's twice as wonderful as War and Peace too, and it's worth the effort. And to try and abridge it is bound to be a disaster, you know. Every abridgement's been a failure, because the essence is in the detail, and the essence is in the sheer architecture of the whole thing, you know. And so it's just, one just has to be patient, you know. I think eventually, you know, probably 50 years after I'm gone, you know, the whole world will be reading Hong Mong, you know. But not in my lifetime, I don't think, you know. But there we go. You know, it's like the whole world does not read Proust, you know. Critics read Proust, and sort of smart, intelligent people read Proust, but I mean, it doesn't sell copies, you know.
But I think that Hong Mong is really not a book so much as a way of life. And people who read the book, myself for example, I just read casually chapters of it, and then sometimes I mean to look up something, and then you just read on until you realize that you've been at it for hours. So I think that it's not a matter of reading the book from cover to cover, but to have it as part of your life. It's something that you dip into, and I think in Western literature there are many books like this, but somehow people haven't connected with this way of reading the Hong Mong. Maybe this is what we should start telling people to do. But what you've been telling is a fascinating story. I didn't know that there's so much background to this, which is
it's
connected.
a pretty depressing story too. It's quite depressing, but also quite interesting. Yeah. But you know, although I was just saying that I wouldn't ever do an abridgment, something I am trying to achieve with some young friends is to create a website, you see, to create something that will help people to join the dots up, to help people to keep them going, so that they can read the book, but at the same time, if they get to chapter 37 and they've forgotten who so-and-so is, they can look them up, you know. It could be a reader's companion, it could also be online, and so far I haven't managed to do it because it's a huge task. I need about 5 enthusiastic young research assistants to help me, and unfortunately I'm not finding the resources to do that at the moment. But you know, I'll keep dreaming of that. But as you say, it's something you just dip into from time to time. You don't read it from cover to cover, very seldom anyway. You might read it once from cover to cover, but you'd never read it again and again and again from cover to cover. You read your favorite moments, you know, and you have your favorite characters, and you want to, you know, I mean, my favorite scene of all is the party given by Feng Ziying in chapter 28. You know, when the sing-song girl and Xue Pan, they all sing songs. And I go back to that chapter again and again and again, because it's so funny and it's so alive, you know. I feel like I'm having a party, you know. And that's one of my favorite scenes. You know, I have others, but that's one of my favorites.
Maybe instead of asking who's your favorite character, you should ask people which is your favorite scene in the book, and maybe people are more forthcoming with telling.
Yeah, right. And then you can gradually get out of them, go around the side. Yeah. I think we should let everyone go.
Yeah, but thank you very much for a really lovely
talk. Thank you for coming.
talk.
Thank you for coming. Thanks a lot. Thank you.